So welcome to everyone here and everyone online. I hope I'm clearly audible. It's a great occasion. We are very delighted and privileged to have Peter Schneck and Laura Zander here, whom I had the privilege of meeting 3 years ago, and Laura's been out since to Bloemfontein. So then at number 3, I think you'll have to start renting an apartment. That's sort of the rule. And we're very excited to hear their talk today about narrative resistance, law migration, and the African literary subject. Just a little bit about our speakers. I'm not going to read the entire bio out. You have it there in your flyer, but a little pomp and circumstance is always called for. So Peter Schneck is Professor and Chair of American Literature and Culture at Osnabrück University and currently the Director of the Institute for English and American Studies. His publications include The US and the Question of Rights, Rhetoric and Evidence, Legal Conflict and Literary Representation in American Culture, as well as numerous essays and editions on visual culture, aesthetics and cognition, and cultural legal studies. Laura Zander is an assistant professor at Osnabrück University and a principal investigator in a cooperative research project with the Institute for English and American Studies at Osnabrück and the chair for international and human rights law, Nora Marquardt, at the University of Munster. The 3-year project is funded by the German Research Foundation and is titled Universal Rights and Global Literature, Human Rights Literacy, Form, and the Subject on the Move. So we're going to be hearing about that subject today. Publications include Writing Back, Reading Forward, Reconsidering the Post-Colonial Approach, and an edited volume, Europe in Law and Literature, Transdisciplinary Voices in Conversation, as well as articles on law and literature, gender and post-colonial studies, and both South African and Caribbean literature. And I believe you're on this project together, this DFG funded project. And we're very excited to hear you speak on the forms of narrative resistance offered by African literature. Thank you very much, Laura and Peter.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much again for having us again, having me again. For those of you, Dani, Karen, who were at our talk yesterday, we spoke a little bit more on the political side, the question of the role, the potential of literature in human rights and migration. And today, because we also wanted to sort of gear today's talk a little bit more toward your research interests, the focus will be more on literary form in that context. And as you said, the African literary subject in African writing. So I will begin. Here you have a quick outline of what we have planned for today. And I will begin with our introduction on narrative resistance and the limits of human rights. In contemporary discussions on migration and displacement, human rights discourse often serves as the dominant framework through which marginalized subjects seek legal and political recognition. Yet as scholars like Joseph Slaughter have argued, this discourse is not inherently liberatory. Rather, it operates within an ideological framework that absorbs claims for justice into existing legal and institutional structures without fundamentally transforming them. Literature, and particularly the novel, has historically played a crucial role in this process, providing and privileging specific narrative forms, for example, the Bildungsroman, that align with the human rights project by projecting the autonomous, self-determined subject as the normative ideal of the subjects of rights. And of course, that's an argument we already reiterated yesterday. In the African context, specifically in literary engagements with migration, the latent ideological complicity between privileged literary forms and law are often challenged, exposing the historical entanglements of human rights with colonial and imperial legacies. Our talk today aims to interrogate the intersection of legal and literary subjectivity in mainly 2 African novels, focusing, and you have them there on the slide, focusing on how contemporary narratives of migration and dispossession reconfigure the migrant and refugee subject outside conventional frameworks of international law and literary canonization. While human rights discourse often assumes a universal, abstract subject in need of protection and/or claiming of self-determination, African literary works disrupt these assumptions by foregrounding alternative modes of belonging, self-definition, and resistance. And of course, as we already discussed yesterday, it's always a question of how much this is done by the works or our specific reading of these works. Drawing on Slaughter's critique of human rights as an incorporative rather than transformative concept, we would like to explore how authors such as Mbolo Mbue and Suniati, among others, deploy narrative strategies that resist containment within regulatory regimes of recognition. By examining these literary interventions, we will argue that African literature does not simply reject human rights discourse, but instead reimagines its possibilities. These texts instantiate what Slaughter calls the productive possibilities of the paradox of human rights, articulating justice not as a fixed legal category, but as an ongoing negotiation of movement, voice, and recognition. Ultimately, this talk considers how narrative itself becomes a form of resistance, reclaiming the right to tell stories as an essential capability for self-determination in both legal and literary terms.
Okay, hope this picks up. Adding another voice to the presentation. It's one presentation, but doing it as dialogue of sorts. And I do not want to cramp the space over there. That's fine. Yeah, so look at this at the seminar part, the lecture part, the seminar, switch back and forth. And I want to add a few comments on theoretical foundations and negotiating African legal and literary subjectivity. Because one of the central hypotheses is that at the core of both human rights discourse and literary representation lies the question of subject formation. That is, how is the individual recognized as a legal, as a narrative subject of narration, but also as a narrating subject? And what are the conditions that enable or foreclose this recognition? In the context of migration or displacement, these questions become especially urgent as the migrant or refugee occupies a liminal space in between legal recognition and exclusion, between narrative visibility and erasure. As Joey Slaughter observes, human rights law depends on a paradoxical formulation of the person, and I quote, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights formally reanimates the citizen subject in its articulation of a human personality, it simultaneously re-exists society and law and comes into being through social interaction and the collective declaration of human rights. This Slaughter calls the tautological structure, which presupposes that the person is a person in order to affect the person as a person. This tautological reveals the circularity of human rights discourse. Rights are granted on the basis of an already existing assumed subjectivity, yet that subjectivity only takes shape through legal recognition. That's his argument, at least. For African subjects on the move, and also their representation in literary texts, pursue this paradox is not merely theoretical, but material, consequential. Following Hannah Arendt's observation that statelessness equates to, quote, a state of human rightslessness, African migrants and refugees, in reality, and also literature, confront the limits of legal personhood, exposing how human rights regimes structurally exclude those who do not fit within their frameworks. Yet, as Slaughter cautions, merely exposing the paradoxes of human rights is insufficient. Instead, he says, you must ask, quote, how might paradox gain political richness when it is understood as affirming the possibility of justice at present and ask articulating the conditions and contours of justice in the future. Question. In other words, rather than treating these contradictions as failures, we can examine their productive possibilities, especially in literature where they are being negotiated, where narrative forms may offer an alternative imaginaries of justice and self-determination, reframing the person as a victim. Slaughter explicitly argues that human rights discourse is inseparable from narrative, particularly as the Bildungsroman, the novel of Bildungsroman, which has historically functioned as what Slaughter calls an enabling fiction by aligning personal development with legal and social incorporation. However, African literary engagements with migration often resist this normative structure, troubling the underlying assumption that subject formation must follow a linear progression towards recognition within state and legal frameworks. Novels such as How Beautiful We Were and Sunayati's The Gold Diggers reconfigure the migrant subject not as one who seeks incorporation into the state's legal order, but as one who faces multiple, often conflicting regimes of recognition and misrecognition. These texts thus tend to reject the narrow socio-historical universality that underpins the human subject, instead offering alternative forms of belonging and political agency that exceed the constraints of the law. At least that would be the result of certain reading of these texts. By positioning human rights, quote, as a culture and a legal regime, as much a matter of literature as of legislation, unquote, Slaughter highlights how narrative plays a constitutive role in shaping legal subjectivity. African literature does not merely critique the exclusion of human rights, but it reimagines this critique in the context of legal and narrative personhood to equally denounce the conceptual constraints of the nation state. The following analysis of How Beautiful We Were and The Gold Diggers will illustrate, we hope, how contemporary African writers disrupt conventional frameworks of migration and human rights, so conventional narratives, not only by exposing their paradoxes, but also by foregrounding possible potential new modes of narrative and human self. One central criticism directed at human rights discourse revolves around the resistance tension between universalism and particularities. While human rights purport to be universal, their articulation, implementation, and legal codification have historically been shaped by particular geopolitical, economic, and cultural forces. This contradiction is not incidental, but constitutive, as Slaughter notes, quote, in principle, the universal needs no adjective, and it is, of course, not possible to make imperialism, international law, or capitalism blush at their venal hypocrisy simply by adding firm adjectives to liberationist ideals that purported to be universal all along. In other words, the claim to universality in human rights discourse often masks the ways in which its normative structures have been conditioned by imperial rule and capitalist theories and practices. This structural paradox extends beyond legal discourse into the realm of literary representation as well. The Bildungsroman, that central medium or form, as Slaughter argues, is a genre that has functioned as a key enabling fiction of human rights, offering a narrative structure that aligns with the liberal humanist vision of individual development and societal incorporation. Like human rights, the Bildungsroman projects an image of the subject whose full realization is predicated on recognition within established legal and social frameworks. However, this incorporationist logic is not neutral. It assumes the model of subjectivity historically rooted on European traditions, the nation state, and bourgeois formation. As Slaughter points out, both modern human rights and the Bildungsroman are reformist rather than revolutionary. Their social preservationist impulses conjoin in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, their safeguarding free and full development of human personality intends to obviate collective violence as a legitimate form of self-determination. It's also in this way, The supposed universality of both human rights and the Bildungsroman functioned as a means of managing diversity rather than radically transforming literary structures. So it's a conservative form of narrative. This insight is particularly relevant to African literature, where authors working in the framework of world literature must often negotiate the demand to represent national identity while simultaneously contesting the very structures that determine legitimacy within that system. As Pascal Casanova has noted, African authors have frequently required to obey the same political and cultural mechanisms that structured the world literary order before a nation gained formal independence. This means that even when African literary works are recognized globally, and a lot of them are, their incorporation into the canon doesn't necessarily challenge the underlying hierarchies that govern world literature. It often reinforces them. There's another form of incorporation. This paradox is at the heart of many contemporary African literary engagements with migration and displacement. Our human rights discourse offers a language for articulating the experiences of marginalized subjects, moving subjects, it simultaneously imposes certain narrative and legal constraints that define who actually counts as a rights-bearing subject. As Zander puts it, quote, the genre of the Bildungsroman provides the normative literary technology by which social outsiders narrate affirmative claims for inclusion in the franchise of the nation state. However, contemporary African writers frequently resist this incorporative logic, unsettling both the literary and legal assumptions that frame the migrant subjects. Novels such as Lewis, Gattis, therefore not merely ask to seek to include the African migrant within the existing human rights framework, they also challenge the very terms by which rights and recognitions are granted. By foregrounding alternative modes of political agency and narrative agency, these texts push against the limits of human rights discourse and its attendant literary forms. They expose what Slaughter calls the dual capacity of language, its ability to serve both as a mechanism for incorporation and as a sign of critique of that. In doing so, they raise fundamental questions about the relationship between literature and law. Can literature imagine a form of personhood that is not contingent on legal recognition? How might African literary narratives articulate rights and justice outside the frameworks imposed by the nation state and world literary systems? In the following analysis, we will examine how these novels engage with these tensions, illustrating the various ways in which African literature both appropriates and resists the universalizing impulses of human rights discourse and narratives. By attending to the narrative strategies these novels employ, we hope to better understand how African literature envisions alternative configurations of legal and legitimate subjectivity. Ones that do not simply seek inclusion in the existing order, but imagine new forms of justice, rooted in recognition, beyond the constraints of the universal, particular divide.
So, before we turn to Imbolo Mbue and the constraints of human rights discourse, I have to reacquire my own manuscript. Because we switched manuscripts and I was completely confused by his notes. This is also why some of the slides came a little later than they should have. My apologies. But I don't understand. And before diving into the literature, I wanted to be able to understand what I'm reading from. Okay. Imbolo Mbue is a US Cameroonian novelist and short story writer whose work has gained increasing recognition after Mbue became a New York Times bestselling author and winner of the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction and the Blue Metropolis Word to Change Award. How Beautiful We Were presents the harrowing story of Kosovo, a small African village caught in the relentless grip of environmental degradation and political corruption. Acts of resilience, agency, and even rebellion both violent and non-violent, unfold over several generations, reflecting the village's persisting struggle against the American oil company Paxton and the latter's collusion with a corrupt government. Through the course of the narrative, Mbue emphatically demonstrates the colonial origins of the ecological devastation suffered by the people of Kosovo and its dramatic consequences for the global South. This aligns the novel with the crossover field of post-colonial eco-criticism, which involves an aesthetics committed to politics, where commitment is expressed not only through physical struggle, but also through forms of epistemic decolonization. In the novel, Mbue interrogates the limits of legal subjectivity and the failure of human rights discourse to deliver substantive justice for marginalized communities. Kosovo's villagers, though directly impacted by corporate and state violence, find themselves excluded from the very legal and political structures that claim to uphold universal human rights. They struggle against Paxton, the oil company that has destroyed their land and poisoned their children for decades. But the struggle is not just a battle for environmental and economic justice, but a confrontation with a legal system that denies them full recognition as rights-bearing subjects. This exclusion exemplifies what Slaughter describes as the paradox of human rights discourse. While ostensibly universal, the framework of human rights operates through mechanisms of selective inclusion, privileging certain subjects while rendering others invisible within the global legal order. Through its narrative, form, and structural choices, How Beautiful We Were exposes precisely these contradictions, revealing the ways in which legal systems and literary traditions alike function as regulatory tools that reinforce rather than dismantle entrenched hierarchies of power. The novel dramatizes this legal erasure in its depiction of the village's attempt to seek justice through international courts. When Tula, some more or less the novel's heroine, along with members of the Restoration Movement, appeals to the American judicial system, she encounters not just bureaucratic obstacles, but an ideological refusal to acknowledge the village's claims. The court's decision to defer the case to Kosovo's own corrupt legal system reinforces the idea that legal subjectivity is contingent on power rather than principle. The judge's rulings that American courts had to stay out of the matter and let the courts in our own country decide whether Paxton and our government had done us wrong illustrates how human rights frameworks often function as performative gestures rather than mechanisms for genuine redress. The villagers lacking political leverage or economic capital are deemed legally unqualified to challenge a multinational corporation, exposing the fallacy of human rights as a truly universal system. This failure of legal recognition is mirrored in the novel's structural and narrative choices, as Mbue resists the conventions of the Bildungsroman, a genre that Slaughter argues has historically served as a literary counterpart to human rights discourse. While the Bildungsroman traditionally charts an individual's development into a responsible legal and moral agent, reinforcing the ideological assumption that self-realization is tied to participation in state-sanctioned legal and political structures, How Beautiful We Were subverts this paradigm by rejecting a linear, individualized model of progress. Rather than positioning Tula as a conventional heroine whose journey leads to personal or political triumph, Mbue fractures the narrative across multiple perspectives, incorporating the collective voice of the village's children and the testimonies of various villages. This choice destabilizes the expectation of a singular, authoritative protagonist and instead emphasizes the communal nature of resistance, a fact that is epitomized in the ambivalent, hypothetical rendering of the novel's ending. So basically, in the end, we never really learn what's happened. Tula's arc, rather than culminating in legal recognition or systemic change, ends in exile and tragedy, albeit it's tragedy that implicates various potential perpetrators, perhaps even herself, reflecting the broader reality that many post-colonial struggles remain unresolved despite their moral and ethical urgency. On another level, the novel clearly critiques the gendered dimensions of both legal and literary subjectivity. Although Tula initially emerges as the intellectual and moral leader of the resistance, her authority is systematically undermined by patriarchal structures within the very movement she helped build. This doesn't play. Her counterparts, rather than embracing her leadership, attempt to fashion her into a real leader through acts of sexual violence, reinforcing the notion that even within revolutionary movements, oppressive hierarchies persist. The conviction that few, if any, would join a movement led by a woman, worse still, an unmarried, childless woman, reflects the pervasive gender norms that undermine Tula's authority, even among those who support the cause. She thus embodies the many women in post-colonial nationalist struggles that have historically been instrumentalized as symbols of liberation while being denied substantive political agency. By highlighting Tula's disempowerment within both the resistance and the broader legal system, Mbue exposes the intersectional nature of injustice, demonstrating how gendered oppression operates alongside neocolonial and capitalist exploitation. Mbue's decision to set the story in a fictional village rather than a specific real-life locale lends the narrative a general, even universal resonance. By portraying corporate capitalist exploitation as emblematic of North-South post-colonial power dynamics rooted in the systemic injustice originating from colonial domination, the novel transcends regional specificity to depict a prototypical scenario of global exploitation. This approach invites readers to view the plight of Kosovo as a ubiquitous condition reflective of struggles faced by marginalized communities all over the world. Yet Mbue also explores the internal dynamics of the collective, subtly questioning whether the village's individual responses, sometimes impulsive and fueled by anger, might not also contribute to their ongoing suffering. The younger generation's shift towards violence, while understandable, for sure, raises questions about the efficacy and moral implications of such tactics. Is our fight against Paxton driven by pain or by love? Could it be driven by love? Should it? Tula asks in the novel. Moreover, the villagers are clearly implicated, as Mbue portrays them in all their foibles and innocence. As Mbue even grants the downtrodden the right to behave despicably, and that's a quote by Shayera Dark, and limits the forced exodus of her villagers to international relocation, she deliberately challenges received notions of more traditional victim-perpetrator paradigms that render Africans passive victims and automatically assume migration routes to the West. The tension between universality and particularity is further explored through the villagers' rejection of migration as a viable solution to their suffering. Unlike many post-colonial narratives in which exile is depicted as an inevitable response to oppression, How Beautiful We Were challenges the assumption that integration into Western legal and political systems is the only path to justice. The village's refusal to abandon Kosovo, even in the face of ecological devastation and state violence, resists neo-colonial narratives that frame Africa as an unlivable space from which its people must escape. Instead, their struggle affirms a radical form of belonging that refuses to accept displacement as a given. Yet this choice is not romanticized. The novel fully acknowledges the costs of remaining, as evidenced by the cyclical nature of suffering endured by multiple generations. The final reflection that it marvels us how much suffering we bore, our parents bore, our ancestors bore, so our children could own cars and forget Kosovo, encapsulates the painful contradictions of this resistance, exposing how structural injustices persist across time despite acts of defiance. Through its cyclical narrative structure, Mbu's novels aligns with Slaughter's critique of human rights discourse as a mechanism that manages diversity rather than enacting transformative change. The village's struggle does not resolve in legal vindication or political triumph, but instead highlights the way in which justice remains an elusive ideal within the global order. By refusing to offer closure, since the past and the future of the country would be identical, Mbu prompts readers to confront the ongoing nature of neocolonial exploitation, reinforcing the idea that resistance, while necessary, is not always met with justice. Ultimately, How Beautiful We Were serves as both an indictment of global legal and economic systems and a meditation on the constraints of literary and political agency, revealing the deep entanglements between narrative form, legal subjectivity, and the enduring hierarchies of power that shape post-colonial existence.
Second example, is Gold Diggers presents an obvious counterpoint to the vision of legal subjectivity and existence found in Lewis How Beautiful We Were. While Lewis villagers remain within their homeland to challenge the neocolonial forces that strip them of agency, the anti-migrants embark on a perilous journey in search of legal recognition and economic security elsewhere. Zander. However, in both novels, the African subjects find themselves trapped in a web of questionable subjectivity, simultaneously acknowledged and raised, present yet invisible within the structures that claim to govern and to protect. By exploring these legal ambiguities and the literary manifestations, the antis novel exemplifies the precarious status of African migrants who, even in the pursuit of legal agency, are continually rendered disposable by state and transnational systems of power. Slaughter's analysis of human rights discourse is deeply intertwined with literary form, provides a framework for understanding how the antis novel exposes the inherent contradictions of legal subjectivity. Slaughter has argued obviously that the Bildungsroman historical power lens the emergence of human rights is both hinged on the notion of the legally recognized subject progressing towards full citizenship. However, in the Gold Diggers, this ideal is systematically so. Rather than moving towards even economic stability, the anti-migrants' characters are subjected to cycles of precarity in which the legal system functions more as an apparatus of exclusion than one of protection. The promise of belonging is always deferred, whether through xenophobic violence, exploitative labor conditions, or the looming threat of deportation. The novel's depiction of migration, especially its framing within the economic and political collapse of Zimbabwe, highlights the illusory nature of legal subjectivity for African migrants. The Zimbabwean state has already failed its citizens, rendering them stateless and figurative sense even before they cross into subjectivity. In Bulawayo, a part city where quote jobs are as scarce as running water, unquote, life is defined by hardship and neglect. Not only was life brutally unfair, it was savagely hard against rights. Migration thus appears as an act of survival, a gamble for the future beyond the borders of a failing state, as individuals are forced into a condition of de facto illegality, not because they have broken any laws, but because the structures meant to sustain them have crumbled. However, Niati's portrayal of migration also interrogates the costs that move, revealing how often the dream of prosperity in South Africa translates into exploitations, xenophobia, and precarity. Unlike Wu's anti-migration plot, which valorizes the village's determination to remain despite overwhelming odds, Niati emphasizes the necessity and promise, even as it entails new forms of self-disillusion. Second, early quotes from the novel. The thought that in a few minutes Lucy would be driving out of this quagmire gave him a fleeting moment of joy. Fleeting, because he would soon return to it. Invariably, nothing would have improved. In fact, the city's condition would probably be worse. This is why the numbers of mobile cargo he carried had increased in the last couple of years. They all had one thing in common: the desire to find refuge in the arms of some African neighbor. As Niati's novel renders blatantly obvious, what was once the city of kings is now reduced to a city whose pulse was faltering as its entire body succumbed to an economic malaise, a tired prostitute screwed of all sanity, life. This bleak depiction of Zimbabwe's decline vividly reflects the very real socioeconomic collapse following the 2008 crisis, which decimated livelihoods, fueled hyperinflation, and precipitated a mass exodus of Zimbabweans seeking survival and opportunity in neighboring South Africa and beyond. Yet his decision to explicitly anchor a narrative in this historical moment situates the goals diggers within the tangible and urgent realities of migration. Their characters' hardships, resilience, and aspirations are directly tied to a specific social context. A notable divergence from Wu's fictional setting, which abstracts the narrative from such concrete historic anchors. While Wu's village operates as a universal allegory of systemic injustice and environmental destruction, Niati's use of historical specificity serves to document and personalize the lived experience of Zimbabwean migrants, making their struggles resonate as those urgent and immediate. Migration, then, in Niati's rendering, is not simply a quest for opportunity, but a desperate attempt to reassert one's existence in a world where the identity has been nullified by economic and political colonists. However, this attempt is met with further evasion upon arrival in South Africa. The migrants are viewed not as rights-bearing subjects, but as intruders threatening the fragile national good. The xenophobic rhetoric that they all deserve to die, every one of them, they deserve to be consumed by the fires of hell, as opposed to reveals how migrants, though present, are violently excluded from legal and social recognition. Yet his narrative structure resists the coherence and linear progression typically associated with market development, mirroring the fragmented and unstable condition of African legal subjectivity. Instead, Niati destabilizes this linear progression, or any hope for this linear progression, was crafting a reimagining of the African subject as shaped by systemic trauma, selective resilience, rather than one who neatly fits within the confines of recognition offered by human rights discourse. The novel is divided into 4 parts: Exodus, the city of gold, gold mining, and the homecoming, which evoke both biblical and capitalist applications. Positioning migration as a form of promised redemption that ultimately fails to materialize. The migrant's journey, though physically directional, is thematically certain. Their struggles remain unused, and their search for stability only leads to further precarity. Instructional resistance reflects what Slaughter describes as fundamental tension in the rights narratives. While they promise inclusion and recognition, they often serve as a mechanism of exclusion, managing rather than resolving the crisis they claim to address. The novel's depiction of gender violence further complicates the question of subjectivity. Women, the gold diggers, are doubly marginalized, as their attempts to secure legal recognition and economic independence are met with patriarchal and systemic barriers. Lindani's coerced involvement in drug trafficking, which ultimately leads to her execution in Malaysia, demonstrates how legal systems selectively criminalize African subjects while offering little protection or support in exploitative structures. Similarly, Portia's precarious existence as a domestic worker in South Africa reflects the broader instability faced by African women in transnational labor economies. As fascinating attributes, these narratives expose how immigration regimes function like various systems of border control, as gendered mechanisms of discipline or surveillance, where African women's bodies become sites, both economic extraction and human vulnerability. Niati's novel thus engages in a form of narrative resistance, challenging the dominant structures that render African subjectivity questionable. By foregrounding the lived experience of migrants, the novel disrupts the sanitized, bureaucratic discourse of immigration policy, revealing the violence and precarity of the line-looking categorizations. The depiction of xenophobic attacks, labor exploitation, state neglect forces confrontation with the realities of African mobility, resisting the neoliberal narratives that frame migration as an individualized choice rather than a structural necessity. Gold diggers criticized the very notion of a stable home by resisting the nostalgic framing of Zimbabwe as lost paradise, instead portraying it as a space of trauma and betrayal, where economic collapse and political violence had already displaced its citizens long before they physically. At the same time, South Africa does not emerge as a land of opportunity, but as another side of disillusion, where legal recognition is conditional on the claim to constantly as at risk. This dual critique aligns with John Komarov's argument that the post-colonial African states and their attempts to position themselves as beacons of modernity and economic progress often replicate the exclusionary and violent structures of colonial governments. Yet, while Niati's multi-perspectival approach highlights the complexities of individual motivations and histories, it also raises questions about narrative form and interpretation. In such a way, Megan Jones observes that, quote, the character arcs, gold diggers, are overwhelmed by a somewhat schematic representation of suffering. Figures like Cain, Lindani's hustling boyfriend, or Dumisani's rapacious wife, Mamonde, reflect this tendency, which risks representing types rather than characters. It is quite clear that this feature is meant to serve a delivering purpose, as it unsettles Niati's predominantly South African audience and seeks to elicit empathy for migrants, even for those entering the country illegally. Through frequent prolapses, Niati contextualizes her characters ostensibly voluntary departures from Zimbabwe's responses to the dire conditions wrought by Mugabe's failed leadership. The novel thus emphasizes how structural cause or structural drives migration as a form of survival rather than aspiration. Rebecca Fussell suggests that Niati's novel, quote, reconfigures diaspora discourse by drawing attention to migrant vulnerability, unquote, while also, quote, illustrating strategies of resistance to identity erasure and or practices of homemaking in precarious contexts. That these moments of agency, fleeting as they are, demonstrate how little room Niati's characters actually have to assert themselves amid the overwhelming accumulation of something. As Jean and John Komarov suggest, this is the paradox of the post-colonial African experience, where it appeals to Renaissance ability to coexist with a phobia about foreigners and enduring cycles of exclusion and violence. Through its kaleidoscopic structure and visceral depiction of suffering, the gold diggers resists simplistic redemption arcs. Fussell thus describes it as a, quote, astute rewriting of the classic Jim comes to Joe, unquote, foregrounding the intersection of gender migration and structural violence.
So to conclude, and I will cut this a little shorter than planned because then at least we have a few minutes for discussion. Yes, narrative resistance and the limits of recognition. Both novels interrogate, or so we argue, the foundational paradoxes of legal subjectivity and literary agency, revealing how the frameworks that promise inclusion, human rights discourse, migration policy, and the very notion of legal recognition are structured to exclude. By centering the African subject within narratives of systemic disenfranchisement, both novels critically engage with the limitations of rights-based recognition, demonstrating how legal subjectivity remains a precarious and conditional status rather than an inherent entitlement. In this regard, the works closely align with Slaughter's argument that human rights discourse operates primarily as an incorporative rather than transformative mechanism, affording certain forms of recognition while leaving others in perpetual limbo. In refusing the conventions of legal recognition and the linear narratives of development associated with the Bildungsroman, both novels enact a form of literary resistance that extends beyond thematic critique. They do not merely depict the failure of human rights discourse, they structurally embody that failure, mirroring the precariousness of legal subjectivity through their own formal instability. Rather than offering their characters stable resolutions or pathways to recognition, they leave them suspended in states of uncertainty, thereby rejecting the logic of progress that underpins both the human rights novel and legal discourse itself. This refusal to conform to literary and legal expectations becomes in itself an act of resistance, one that gestures towards alternative ways of imagining justice, belonging, and narrative possibility outside the constraints of universality. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It was such a wide-ranging talk. It's given us a lot to think about. I was trying to rejoin the team to meet and see if any questions online. But now we can start with the question in the room. It's not it's allowed. I'll get the ball rolling. But let me turn on my mic.
Probably take.
Yeah, take this one.
That makes sense of scribbles.
Take this. Give it back.
Hi everyone. I hope you can hear me online. Hunter, can you just verbally confirm?
I can verbally confirm.
Okay,
yes.
great. So you might have missed that. Gave Peter and Laura a round of applause for a fantastic paper that's given us a lot to think about. And my question, and please submit your questions online, those attending online. I'll look at the speech bubbles in a second. It's maybe a two-parter. And I'm thinking as I'm speaking, I'm thinking about the overlap between canon formation and form. So to come back to that quote, aesthetics committed to politics, and what seems to me to be a fundamental juxtaposition between the world novel or world literature and the African novel, where world literature is sort of shorthand for an already conformed mode of writing that's not necessarily conforming in the way that it's written, but in the way that it's consumed. And I wonder, is there not a Russian doll effect? Is African literature treated as a kind of counterpoint, not subject to the same critique, and not critique, but the same sort of consumptive logics, where what Western readers want from the African novel is a circular novel where human rights are shown to be denied. So an analogy here would be something like poverty porn, which there was this famous debate, I'm sure you're aware of, in 2012 around poverty porn and African writing with the Kane Prize, that African writers like Violet Bulawayo were selling out the very hard conditions of Zimbabwe and other African countries, and other writers doing the same, so as to secure the esteem of prizes like that won by Mbue. Is there a question in that? Is the question. I suppose the question is, what danger is there in saying, so let me restore to this, is this refusal to conform not a type of forming itself?
Is that the question?
That's the question. I got there.
Because he said it's two-part. So.
Yeah, no, sorry, too stranded. That's it.
Are you handling this to me? Question. Yeah, it's a spontaneous saying, well, it's this catch-22 logic.
Yeah.
And very difficult to get out of that without adding yet another of the dolls to the base.
Exactly.
Well, another doll within the doll. It looks slightly different, but it's basically, Yeah, I see that. As you said, it's a matter of consumption. And I take it that one of the attempts of our readings is to read a little bit against the grain in this respect, but also acknowledging that these novels, like Bildungsroman, are written under certain constraints, but also affordances that given by the various audiences and expectations of audiences, which are also expectations of markets, publishers, not necessarily the same, but resonating one way or another. So we're looking at something that is not simply completely free from these constraints, but written under these constraints and expectations, and published under these constraints and expectations. And of course, we it's not so obvious in the closed reading which we're trying to do, but of course we also look at the particular way of reception of these novels that they get. So the question here would be Muller, how beautiful were it is received on a global scale as an example of an African voice that is poetical, aesthetic, and so on. So it's already celebrated as an example of African literature that speaks to the whole world.
Yes.
I don't think that this is something that was said on Piaggi's novel.
Oh, okay.
Because that plays out with a different audience, a different resonating room sphere, which we have to take into account. We look at why is this written in a particular way and how is this written. And from a perspective, we can arguably say that who is writing from US colonial perspective that is maybe also influenced by certain forms of professionalism. Literary writing in the US, for instance, and entering into certain forms of distribution, critical reviewing, pre-reviewing, etc., etc. There's a whole apparatus behind that. When we look at the final product, we might have to take that into account while trying to answer your question. Meaning, is there ever a way out of following the format or refusing the format as a response to the format? That's what you're saying. Is there a third alternative? And I think the third alternative is a careful reading of where and how the refusal is, used and indicated by the novels themselves. Is there an awareness of that kind of situation which they are writing? That would be my
fantastic.
preliminary answer.
Yeah, it's
very challenging.
Yeah.
Grant you that. So every time I use the word African literature, I don't know what that is. It depends on who you're talking to. Exactly. Of course, making an argument in what situation to what audience what African literature stands for. But it's certainly a construct. It's a definition that produces African literature.
Sorry, may I jump in? Did
You need
Oh, you mean?
use the mic.
So it's recorded.
Yes, maybe I missed it, but did you present these books as African books? I didn't hear that at all. Or maybe I guessed. And I didn't. I'm very much unenlightened on this topic because I didn't know either of these authors, and I had to Google them. And then I discovered that the first one is Cameroonian, but actually an American writer.
Yes.
So to talk of her as an African writer is already problematic. And maybe you avoided that. It's clearly a story set in Cameroon, but written by, to all accounts, it's an American writer. Presented as, I think, to my mind, if you have to look at the paratext, the covers of the books, they're presented as typically African books. It's really somewhat controversial, but if they, from the judging on the covers, they look like African books. But at least the one, to my mind, not an African, rather than an American writer. That's one thing. And the other thing is that I noticed that you are both academics doing American studies.
Yes, I do.
Oh, not sorry.
Post-colonial, on the way.
I'm also opposed to it.
What do you do when you do American studies? I don't think we have it in South Africa, or do we?
I think the people who work on American literature, but not as a department or an area, you know.
And American studies reading African books, isn't that contradiction?
Yeah,
Enough said.
you want to answer? I will answer to the Americans reading African books, not African books.
I mean, something that perhaps we didn't make as explicit today, but made way more explicit yesterday, is that these two novels are just a very small part of a very large research project, which is, as you read the title before, is focused on global literature. And one of our main hypotheses is that migration literature, what we call fictions of migrancy, can be seen as a new genre that is no longer, in a way, located specifically to areas in the world, although, of course, at the same time, specific conflicts, specific political conditions, of course, play a very big role. But that as a genre, it's very universal because migrancy as a contemporary phenomenon is a very global phenomenon. And that for many of these works, they are often not published from the geographical location where the author originates from, or marketed in different places, marketed even in different languages. I mean, a lot of some of the works are even written in a different language, but only then published in English. So this is sort of the larger setup. And that also explains why Peter, I mean, his very specific sort of origin within the project is the US-Mexican border. And migration in that as very specific sphere. And I'm more because my area of expertise is post-colonial South African literature, but also Caribbean. And so I mainly focus on the African, Europe, African, but also Australia. I mean, everywhere where there's a lot of literature that focus on indefinite detention, on migration. Context. And we just decided for today that it might be most interesting for the audience here to actually look at the African part more than, for instance, compare US-Mexican example with. But on the other hand, of course, or maybe you.
Yeah.
Yes, ask me.
It's a very touchy question. It's touchy because it points to a conundrum at the very core of a project. That is, are we engaged in a huge scheme of poaching books, topics, subjects, and so on? Because your interpretation counts as African literature. And in this case, you really made it very clear this is a US-American writer. I don't think she would agree to that completely. She would have some arguments on her side saying, look at what I'm writing about. And most of which is also linked to my personal experience and to my family's experience, and to my country's experience, to my collective experience, etc., etc., etc. And in what way is that not African? Less African. It's writing from a diaspora perspective, for instance. Second generation maybe, but nevertheless, we would have a problem writing about migration literature at all if we would use very restricted forms of nationalist writing. Okay. That's one, but I grant you that this is one way of defining it, drawing the line. The conundrum lies in the fact that this drawing the line always comes with a claim for. In this sense, so you actually make a claim for me, the Americanist, reading Lure as an American book of literature. You actually make a claim for that because you said she's American. But my claim as an Americanist for reading that book would be a quite different claim, would be a question about what were the enabling conditions that made this book possible, beyond the fact that someone had to sit down and write it as a publication for a particular audience, enabled by an American publishing house that scouted her, that supported her, and so on, so on, so on. And it's on market for this book. So that shapes that book, no matter what, as an American, as a production. And that's where my interest is. My interest is not in claiming this as an American form of American literature, but I'm claiming it as something that involves an activity that is clearly American in the sense, for instance, appropriating, poaching topics, issues, agendas from all over the world. So when you look at the publishers of these two novels and make a comparative analysis of the purchasing power, by which I also mean the purchasing power producing critical awareness of these books, you will clearly see that there is an asymmetry between the two publishers in this. So, and that also, of course, speaks to the particular audience that these books are written for. That reflects back on the form in which they very much. You could make an argument that there is a deliberate, deliberate way of fulfilling certain expectations of global African literature in Brewer's case. You can see that actually in the reviews in the New York Times, for instance, right? Or would the New York Times write about a book like this, calling it an African book, an exemplar form of African literature? What interest does the New York Times have in that? That's whereas United book it's very different received, very different audience in mind, and that would also, I think, explain its particular strategic choices of narrative strategies. We talked a little bit about the almost stereotypical shaping of characters. So we use the stock figures basically within the narrative that is familiar to certain audiences, more than other audiences. So I'm aware that this do not satisfy the definition of what is African and what is legitimately a subject for an Americanist approach. But there is a theoretical underpinning to what we do, which we call transnational cultural studies. Those, of course, would be a central approach when we, for instance, talk about a global genre in animal form literature that is not tied necessarily to a national corpus, but presents itself as belonging to the world. Whose claims that? What discipline will you find in people? There's no discipline. There's no department for literature. Well, actually there is. It's mostly found in US universities.
And UK, a lot of
UK.
yeah.
just quickly want to share, because that sort of ties back to your question. The interesting thing is, I mean, among the two, Miyagi's novel is definitely the one you could accuse of poverty porn. I mean, it's really it's a very it's sort of would be a very likely sort of argument to be made. On the other hand, it's exactly the kind of novel that wasn't written at all to win a prize or to be marketed internationally. But Miyagi very much wrote it as someone who came from Zimbabwe to South Africa, who experienced xenophobia here, and who really thought, as sort of an activist, by writing this, she could change how people treated foreigners in South Africa. And so, does that make a difference? One can ask. It's a sort of a very different setup, and her intention very clearly was, by being very blunt, being very to shock her readers into, you have to change, you have to. But I mean, this question and these questions are part of the project, and we will deal with them, have to deal with them.
It's a question to me. Is the category of poverty porn, is that already a static category? It's a category of evaluation, discrimination. Well, it's bad literature. Poverty porn is bad literature. Well, it's literature, in Miyagi's case, it's literature with a purpose. It's written with a purpose.
Yeah, just
how do these two ways of looking at literature intersect? Is political literature per se bad literature because it tends to strategically use forms that are more effective, in your face, like this, widely distributable because they do not pretend to be aesthetic in any way, but simply popular.
yeah. Sure. Oh. So, I'm just standing here thinking about the question.
Well, you have your own mics.
Yeah, I do.
That's okay.
I have something different, so.
Please, yeah.
Because I wanted to continue with. So
No problems.
I was thinking about your lecture yesterday about human rights education and using narratives when I suppose it goes both ways. So in law we teach human rights to draw on literature, but vice versa in English departments draw on human rights. But I suppose I was thinking about reading strategies you were talking about and different ways of reading and using the more traditional novels with different reading practices instead of going to the counter novel. So Slaughter's, I know the one Slaughter piece quite well. He starts off with Robinson Crusoe and how this was invoked at a very specific moment when international human rights was coming, and the different readings. So the Australian delegate who used it in a specific way, and then it was countered by the Belgian, and then the Russian delegate came in. So it shows how Robinson Crusoe as the founding text for the building or the enabling fiction for human rights already had various possible readings. So I was wondering about so we could use these books, but we could maybe also use Robinson Crusoe with alternative reading. So I was wondering a bit about that. But then, as I was thinking, it depends also when we talk about human rights, the kind of definition of the story that we tell about human rights become. So the traditional one would be the buildings one, and I mean what Slaughter's phrase is that in building you become what you already is. That's what becoming is. And that's very much the natural rights theory, because you're born with human rights and then it's taken away from you, but at some stage you achieve it. But if you think of human rights not as something that is natural, that's born with you, but it is only a product of political action, then there's a different story. It may also be a building one, but I don't know. But then it's not this, because you're born with nothing and you only have rights because of democratic participation or whatever. So that I was trying to think of a novel that could tell that story. Like you might know, I don't. But then just thirdly, and this is my own interest, because let me see.
Oh, you've been kicked out. No.
Because I'm interested in Elena Ferrante. So she's writing about violence, gender violence, but there's no inclination going to rights. And she specifically says, my story is not about equality, women's equality, women's rights. She refers to the antiquity. She goes back to the story of antiquity and sort of the myths.
Mhm.
So there's also a way of addressing the thing that I think we are concerned about, injustice, but without going to rights. Well, maybe that's your project. But maybe so my question is why human rights? Even as someone in law, I'm not particularly interested in human rights. So why human rights? So sorry, three, four. All right.
Just say for those online, we are. I'm just going to say. Sorry, when we are running over time, so if you've got to go, your excuse. Thank you for joining us. The discussion continues to be lively here, so we're going to carry on. You're welcome to listen in.
Doesn't speak about that at all. And so we're not looking for literature only where you have these kind of legal procedures, trials, border officials denying someone entry and so on. But quite a bit. I mean, if you take those two in the art, you could say it's the absence of any sort of legal, administrative, whatever presence. It's a very, very large looming absence in the whole novel, that apart from the very, very ending where one or two of the bad guys basically are then caught by the police. But apart from that, it's actually the other way around, where you feel there's no noteworthy legal structure that can in any way support, and which then of course also means the characters, the very few characters that actually make it in one way usually do through the help of others. So it's an argument of solidarity. But I mean, one of our central interests is this turning around or looking at migration and the subject on the move, not as a victim, not as someone who needs help, or but as someone who has a right to certain, for instance, to asylum or to be recognized as a refugee, and how these how literature and narrative can make claims that allow for people on the move, whether it's in fictional or non-fictional writing, to be seen also in this sort of more wider discourse on migration, not as help-seeking, powerless individuals. I mean, this is one of the sort of perhaps you want to add to this.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by your sentence now. I'm not interested in human rights, even though I'm in law, right? I'm not interested in it. How can you not be interested in human rights? But of course, as a subject, as something that is that shapes the literature you're reading. So, and in a way, we are, and I would confess to that, always forcefully asking the question, how does that relate to the kind of subject we connect to the subjective rights of human rights, the universal subject. That's the claims. Now, it's hard to argue against, saying I can read Ferrante without that question at all, right? You'd say, I don't have to think about human rights when reading Ferrante. Like, wonderful as literature. But then, of course, the question is, this question we start out with is, what kind of subjectivity does literature project, create? What are you resonating with when you read Ferrante in terms of what kind of subjectivity are we responding to? Is that a subjectivity that you expect in a certain way? Does it respond to certain forms of identification, understandings of subjectivity as it adequately belongs to such a form of reality? So we're kind of twisting this and saying, our understandings of literature, like our understandings of rights, is based on certain expectations about narratives and expressions of subjectivity as expressions of subjectivity and expressions of agency, including a form of interiority that we connect to what we call the full subjectivity, full development, a form of interiority, a form of experience, a form of expression that we connect to that we associate with that. All psychologies are built on that expectation, that are connected to that. It's not in any way kind of criticism. Well, it's a way of explaining why we try to use that question about subject formation in law and literature. Why we cannot connect it, because there is an argument that is explicit, of course, the sort of argument is that legal acknowledgement, whether it's in the way of human rights or rights, civil rights, is tied to a particular assumption about person, subjects. For instance, that they're capable of making rational decisions. Think about contract agreements. So these assumptions are linked to certain narratives and sub-narratives. And this is how we can actually form our expectation about other subjects. And it's done through these basic scripts and narratives, forms of expression. That's the best.
If there was a class, they would have come in 20 minutes ago, so I don't think it's an issue.
So yes, I would love to see a reading of Ferrante from the perspective of even though there's nothing in there. You say, no, it's not. It doesn't have to be explicitly about the question. It's about the subjectivity we connect to the full developed personality of the person, the richness of inner life, something like that. It goes to the question of, for instance, authenticity. It's linked. That's the outcome. Historically, this is linked.
That's also taking a very narrow slice of history, isn't it? Saying that the legal framework is the framework by which subjectivity is defined.
Yeah. Well,
so we're talking about the modern subject. We're talking about the last 400 years, and yeah, what other? I mean, one can draw the line anyway. What other structures enable that? Anyway, sorry, fine.
That's why they. Sorry, I don't have the mic.
Sorry. Come on, if you've got to go, please go. Sorry, we are running well over time, so thanks for coming.
This is what we came.
Yeah, exactly. Miss, can I? Get them thing.
Like parents.
I think I don't mean it disparaging, but easy or obvious to give a human rights reading when you read Ferrante, because it's about about women and sexual violence, and it's in a specific context, the context of the Second World War when human rights start coming. So I think that would be in a way quite easy to do that. Not easy, but that of course it's a story about, you know, and it is of course a Bildungsroman also. It's a kind of, but I'm just, and of course we're not obsessing what the author is saying, but Zander herself is saying, I'm not writing this because my concern is women's equality. And maybe that's her being influenced by French feminism and Irigaray and Italian feminism, who also had a very specific view about rights and
Yes.
and women's and what. But she says I'm writing about sort of, well, she uses, I think she uses the term antiquity or myths, and she's trying to deal with subjectivity, but maybe feminine subjectivity, women's subjectivity. But I don't think via rights. So like, you know, so for me, it's definitely a question of but maybe rather say justice than rights, or poverty, or, you know, the very sort of material socioeconomic circumstances, but then also on the level of the psyche, because I think there is also sort of some Lacanians, there's some psychoanalysis also informing Ferrante. No, so I suppose I was just, but of course that's your project. Your project is to look at human rights. But I was just thinking that I teach jurisprudence, not human rights. But I would also rely on literature. But I will probably not necessarily do the right, you know. So that my question is why human rights? But of course, there's a lot. I understand why doing human rights. But I suppose, and to think about subjectivity, but to always already link it to the modern legal subject, I think would probably be problematic. Particularly if we're talking post-colonialism, why take the modern legal subject as?
I think one sort of the main reasons is that apart from human rights, our main interest is migration, and that we see the migrant as sort of an embodiment of that very paradox that human rights should protect the migrant in that situation where there is no civil rights to do so, and that human rights in practice very often fail.
Well, that's not Harvard. I mean,
Exactly, and this is basically the sort of starting point. What we're looking for, we're looking at, and I don't think you could. I mean, it's not merely a question of justice. It's really a question of
so many kind of all over the place. When you say jurisprudence instead, I'm almost, you almost have me at the point where you say, oh, let's use a different word or different concept or whatever. But the fact is that you're looking at human rights not as something very definite, but something as a discourse that is, steeped in universalisms. And that is universalist in relation to legal systems that are bound for their time to nation states. So when you say jurisprudence, my question would be, is your jurisprudence, your idea of jurisprudence, linked to a specific legal system? No. So there's a universalist assumption of specific jurisprudence, right? And that's the same with justice. When you say justice, right, there's a certain universalist assumption about that. It is then, any legal system you find how that translates into underground conditions. But that's exactly what this kind of universalism is covered by human rights discourse very much. for a reason. It's like historical. So look back to Zander. This is where it comes from. And we can bring in. I'm so sorry. If I had conclusive answers, the project would be over. But the point is to say, bring in a parent. The parent's argument, of course, is it's not that these people don't have rights. It's that the people that don't have rights don't have political agency. That's the main point. And then, of course, the questions: what's Hannah Arendt's idea about the necessity of political agency? It's linked to a sort of a conviviality of living together. That's there. And there we are. We have a universal or a transnational idea of what that means or what that could be. But of course, that has historical origins. It comes from certain forms of experience and so on and so on and so on. And it's linked to an understanding of the potential of people living together. That potential. See what I mean? What I'm getting at?
I have a faint suspicion. Please tell me that I'm wrong. That these two books are less good than they're useful for your project. It's very interesting case studies, but they're not really good literature. Am I wrong?
I want to say, we use the word good literature. We put something in between there. Good for what?
Yeah, it's all literary scholars, we know.
Yeah. Basically, we are drawn. There are specific reasons why we use or we look at certain literature, which we still are in the process of identifying. So, one of the most obvious indications that these books, at least one of these books, has been celebrated as an example of global literature, and that gives us pause. So, okay, this is about this universal idea of justice. This is about, in wide sense, human rights. And at the same time, it is being celebrated as an exceptional piece of literature, ethical, aesthetic, etc., etc. And that combination is, to return to the poverty point, is that there is a form of evaluation discourse that connects a particular understanding of what is good literature with this. And political stance. And we're interested in that. How is this canon of literature that works like that being established? Obviously by writing these books, but also by publishing them, but also by reviewing them, putting them together and making them, like Robertson Crusoe, making them the ground for theoretical analysis of the novel, of the Bildungsroman, etc. Just passing the most astounding and amazing thing about the whole Robinson Crusoe thing in the debate about human rights was that everybody knew the book. Everybody had read the book. So that is the kind of global thing that we're looking for, right? So there was this was a form of universal cultural thing, even though the readings, kind of were different, which of course is to be expected, but they knew the thing. It was just surprising. And then it's not surprising. It's an early example of that kind of literature that speaks to that assumption, universality. So yeah, I definitely you can use also we could use Robertson Crusoe. So then you can
Is it a good book?
Yeah, I could maybe answer your earlier question, sort of routing it through front rows, because I wouldn't be, and I think it is in the eye of the beholder, right? So that's what makes poverty porn and what makes good literature. That kind of trite argument, but one got the parody by Nana Benyaminga, right? That's now recently being collected. And the point of the parody is that it is an easily replicable form. And tying this all together, Bildungsroman questions of exploitative writing, the common denominator is a kind of unreflexive realism, seems to me. And that's why I was interested in the phrase, the aesthetics committed to politics, because what aestheticizes the issue in these works? That's the question, right? So I've not read either, so I can't say that's what I would be interested in. In what way is the harsh reality filtered and crystallized in a way that we are not already conditioned to see in these readily consumable ways? And it's an impossible question to answer, because the goodness of, let's say, Mbue's novel, you mentioned the whole apparatus behind it, right? So these African writers going to American creative writing schools, taught to the market is shaped by these creative writing schools. There's a fantastic new book that you might know, Dan Sinekin's Big Fiction, about publishing houses, how they shaped, how they shaped the future Pulitzer Prize winners and the shape the minds of judges, and ultimately conditioned us to see this is the standard for good writing. So it's very difficult, and even the experimental novel is replicable. Right, so and that's why one should treat the phrase aesthetics committed to politics always with question mark, even if you're emphasizing a kind of alienating aesthetic. Perhaps, again, not having read Neo-Nazi's novel, but perhaps the brutalism in it is a kind of transgressive realism in the way that something like American Psycho is transgressive realism. It's, so, yeah, I don't have an answer. Yes. It's all surface. Yeah, so that's taking realism to another extreme.
It's one of the examples that I had. Example that I had in mind is something like the fugitive slave net produced by abolitionist societies. That always depicts scenes of violence, very graphic violence, calculated in order to effect a certain form of indignation. Empathy that moves beyond empathy becomes a form of indignation about injustice being done.
Torture scenes. Elizabeth Costello, willing to write about the torture scene in the dark chat. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would rather connect it to that. It has a purpose rather than that.
You mean this type of realism?
Yes. In the case of Alice.
No, I'm using it totally unrelated. I don't think the paradigms match, again, because I've not read the text, but I'm saying perhaps in an overly blunt type of realism, which some poverty porn does do. It puts it so in your face that. And that's what makes Benjamin's parody quite good, is that it makes everything hyperbolized, and therefore you realize what happens when you slip into the seductions of a well-told tale.
I always ask whether we can find an explanation for using this as a strategic. Example is not accidental. That it's not never accidental. I don't know how many accidental things to find. The thing that has to walk to all these oops in order to get published. I'm not talking about fan fiction or stuff like that, even though that's also interesting. Fan fiction reproduces, everything is replicable. And of course, that's something that happens there as well. But the assumption that something is motivated helps to dig into the combination of motivations that actually shape it. And not simply, what's the ideal, of course, is that it's shaped only by the author. But that, of course, it's just
You think that's
fiction.
sort of suspect ground, like intentional fallacy and all, but just the most, particularly in a case of complex identity, like an African author having spent half her life in America, shaped by these illustrious schools, and shaped by the people around her. To what extent is the desire, the mimetic, and not the desire to express what I've experienced in the past, but desire to achieve the success around me, right? So it's a handy tale because it's instantly, the exotic is instantly sellable. So I'm suspect, I'm suspicious of motivation, like but it is an interesting question that you said, if you take away everything, what it took for the writer to write this without their motivation, without the writing school, so that is an interesting question because it comes down to sort of organic social forces that give rise to, I don't know, repressed desires, repressed angst. I don't know. It's just I don't like personally thinking about what might have motivated a writer to write something. It's too fraught. Yeah. Or do you engage in? Let's say you do. Do you engage with substantial, with the great canon, like with their interviews, their letters, where available, of course. Is that important to the project? Was it only sort of its reception?
Cannot deny that, overlook it. It's part of, for instance, we have quite a number of authors who not only write fiction, but also opinion pieces about migrations and something like that. So rights. So they're highly political, they're activists. So of course you have to look at them writing as well to see. And when I say motivation, I say I don't really know what the motivation was, but the motivation is an assumption that helps me to look at certain strategies as strategies with a purpose. That is
Okay.
and then we say what would have been, what could be the purpose of using that strategy? What kind of effect is that after? This is the way I look at motivation. So it's not like, oh my God, can we find an evidence for this motivation? He or she did it for that purpose. What we can see is, however, that there are certain form of decisions, strategic, using, for instance, spreading out the narrative over quite a number of different subjects that tell stories is a decision. So it's logistic decision, static decisions, it's a strategy. And you find why did they do it? You ask the question, what does it affect?
Yeah.
When reading it, right?
That's
maybe that was the motivation. That was the purpose all along to achieve that effect. That's what we're saying. This is what we ask our students: why did you do this? You can see the example that I used to, fugitive slave marriage, is a wonderful example because it's such a rigid form, but then once in a while someone steps up and uses the form and completely appropriates it and turns it into something else. And you can see that, and when you look into it, you see by explicitly following the form, but ever so slightly undermining it, affirming it and undermining it at the same time. So going back and forth. So wonderful examples are almost missing when you blink an eye, but it's very carefully done. Very, very good. I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass. It's sentence by sentence reading. These are the illegal texts. And you go like, wow, this is really written with knowledge of that. And it was triggered by your sensitivity. It's not natural. People are not born with it, right? Yeah. Then they're born and they have rights. Of course, their birth just matches the truth. This is a very expensive thing in slave liberties. So I was born a slave. Why? Because they were not registered. They were simply added into ledger. Like that. So there's always a pre-existing system that's capitalized people according to the rights they don't. So there's say that yeah, the question of parsing the natural from the positivist technology rights is difficult when it comes to you come to exist in a pre-existent system. Categorization. There is no natural state that would, but still, the very fact that you're born brings you into that system. Naturalization. Citizen, birthright citizenship.
I'm thinking of Paul Beattie's sellout.
So,
So yeah, I don't want to. Sorry.
No, I mean, we'll continue to, I was with another, no, it's about different theories. How do we, what's the origin of rights? And the mainstream one, the liberal one, the classical liberal one would be natural rights. So that's, but the backstory is was the shifts from the in all natural law tradition from something in Greek times where we don't even call it law, natural law, Antigone as the first sort of assertion, maybe of, well, she's not even referring to natural law, she's referring to the law that defines God. Yes. Then at some stage, maybe the sophists, they will start talking about a natural right going to be evil times, all this time, up we now. So there's this, but then definitely your early moderns pops off. Well, so there's this desire to get out of the natural state, but also the natural state is just disaster and unsafe, whatever. But then, so the two reasonings there, if you think of the social contract theory, the one is will abdicate rights, the other one will say no, it's no obstacle whether you support the monarchy or not. But then what happens there at natural rights becomes human rights eventually. So initially, the rights would be the right of the monarch, or maybe the right of God, the right of monarch, but then it's the individual subject as bearer of right. But I think it's one like an Arendt will reject that, saying no, you only become a bearer of right once you're part of a political society. So you're not born with a right. So but some people will say even if you're a slave, you're born with a right. The right is just not recognized or acknowledged. But that's different from saying we don't enter this world with rights as bearers of rights. It's only once we become part of a political community that we can say, we are a bearer of rights. And I mean, whether you agree with it, and I think whatever your theory of the origin of rights maybe will differ, maybe also how one respond to the notion of Bildung and how it relates to rights. Or not, maybe not. But I'm thinking however one defines rights will influence maybe the role of literature in making sense of rights. Yeah, but also I mean, in the decolonial context where people are really rejecting, as Western. They're not even saying we're rejecting universalism, but we're rejecting rights. So that's, or at least, or then the other option is a certain version of rights. I mean, what is the Lord saying? You can't dismantle the master's house by using his rights. And that's right. So that's, but then others would say, no, African human rights is really radically different from Western rights. It isn't really that particular rights. Right. Therefore, I think even Slaughter refers to Buxley challenging also. But anyway, in the human rights lawyer, I mean, for philosophies, it's just space. No. But, and I mean, but no, I mean, looking forward also to what you do with Roussetti. You know, that's all for ways.
No,
Have an easy time here in this small room.
my colleague Basil will hopefully will be there because he will always, when I criticize rights, he will say he doesn't understand why anyone criticize rights. For him, a right, it gives you one the opportunity to ask why.
I was reminded of that yesterday when you spoke. When you spoke about the virtue of the story is that it focused on asking questions. And that said something to me. I thought exactly of what you just said.
Yeah, so but look, right, there's nothing Western or universal or anything. A right is just, you know, the right one with the opportunity to say why. Why are you thinking? And that opens all discourse of resistance.
My understanding of rights is not based on any narrative origin story of things. I know that they exist, but that's it. My question would be one on four. What is the function of having or religious groups in Islam? I'm not sure about entanglement. In that regard, it's a fiction. It's a useful fiction. It's a very powerful fiction. It needs a particular discourse. Part of the discourse would be why. It allows you to ask a question. Why are you doing this? Why is that? Etc. Etc. It also allows you to formulate claims. Etc. Etc. So that's what I'm interested in.
Oh, you've been fine. Yeah, that's why you didn't respond to my question on values yesterday.
No. I'm saying it just tongue in cheek. A lot of tongue in cheek.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.